He was building a simulation, a vast, complex computer program that would recreate the conditions of the cosmos just a few 100 million years after the Big Bang. He had to code the laws of physics, the soup of primordial hydrogen, the mysterious dark matter, and the eventual, fiery birth of the first stars. Late one night, long after the others had left, Eris was alone in the control room. The main lights were off and the only illumination came from his monitor, painting his face in blue and white light. He started the simulation. On the screen, a black expanse appeared. This was his digital universe. It was empty and dark. For a long time, nothing happened. This was the period known as the Dark Ages. It was a universe without light. Eris watched, his eyes feeling heavy. It was like watching paint dry on a cosmic scale. Then, almost imperceptibly at first, tiny points of light began to flicker on. These were his simulated first stars. They weren't like our sun. They were monsters. Behemoths that burned a brilliant blue-white and died in spectacular supernovae within a few million years. As they ignited, their intense ultraviolet light began to flood the digital cosmos. This light started to interact with the fog of hydrogen gas that filled his simulation. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the light began to burn the fog away, changing its fundamental properties. This process should leave a specific fingerprint, a shadow, on the radio waves that would eventually travel across billions of light years to their telescope. Eris leaned forward, his heart beating a little faster. He told his program to analyze the radio signature of his simulated universe. A graph appeared on a second screen. It was a line similar to the one from their real telescope, and there it was, a dip, a shadow, in almost the exact same place as their real signal. It wasn't a perfect match. Their real signal was stronger, deeper. The universe, it seemed, had been even more dramatic than his model predicted. But the basic shape was there. The ghost in his machine had a ghost in its machine. He felt a shiver go down his spine. It was one thing to have a strange signal. It was another to have a theory that could actually explain it. This was no longer just a curious blip. It was potential evidence. He was looking at a digital echo of the cosmic dawn. Just then, the door to the control room creaked open and Alara peeked in. "Dr. Thorne?" I saw the lights were still on. I forgot my phone charger. She trailed off, seeing the intense look on his face and the two graphs side by side on his screens. "What is it?" Eris turned to her, a slow smile spreading across his tired face. He pointed from one screen to the other. "Look," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Our shadow has a shadow." Alara walked over, her eyes widening as she understood what she was seeing, the real data and the simulated data, telling what looked like the same story. "It's real," she breathed. "It's really real, isn't it?" "It's starting to look that way," Eris said, the weight of the moment settling on him. "But this is where the real work begins. Now we have to convince everyone else." He saved the simulation and shut down his computer. As he walked with Alara out into the cold desert night, the sky above was a breathtaking tapestry of stars. He looked up at the Milky Way, a river of light stretching from one horizon to the other. Every one of those stars was a descendant of those first monstrous suns he had just simulated. For the first time, he felt a direct connection to that ancient epoch. They weren't just astronomers in a remote desert. They were detectives, and they had just found the first fragile clue at the scene of the oldest crime in the universe, the moment light was born. The excitement in the desert facility was a fragile bubble, and Eris knew it could pop at any moment. The matching signal from his simulation was a powerful piece of the puzzle, but it was a puzzle only they were looking at. To the rest of the scientific world, their discovery was still just a glitch, a story they were telling themselves in their remote outpost. The bubble met its first real test a month later. Eris was invited to present his findings at a small specialized conference in a nearby city. It wasn't a huge, flashy event, but it was filled with the very people whose papers he had been reading for years. The experts in the field. The night before his talk, in a generic hotel room that smelled of cleaning products, Eris practiced his presentation. He clicked through the slides, his voice a low murmur. He showed the graph with the dip, the results of their interference checks, and finally the compelling match from his simulation. On the screen it all looked so logical, so clean, but in his gut, it felt like he was about to stand on a stage and tell a room full of serious people that he had heard a whisper from the beginning of time. The next day, the lecture hall was about half full. The air was cool, the lighting was dim, and the audience was quiet. Eris stepped up to the podium, his notes trembling slightly in his hand. For the first 20 minutes, everything went smoothly. He explained their methods, their painstaking checks for local interference. A few people in the audience nodded. Then he showed the slide with the signal. "And this," he said, his voice gaining a little confidence, "is the persistent absorption profile we have detected. We believe it is a strong candidate for the signature of the Lyman alpha coupling from the cosmic dawn." He paused, letting the graph sink in. The room was silent. He then brought up his simulation, showing the side-by-side comparison. This was his big moment. The silence broke. A hand went up in the second row. It was Dr. Evelyn Reed, a renowned cosmologist from a prestigious university. She was known for her sharp mind and even sharper tongue. "Dr. Thorne," she began, her voice crisp and clear in the microphone, "this is a very intriguing signal. But the amplitude, it's remarkably strong, much stronger than most models, including your own preliminary one, would predict. How can you be sure you're not simply seeing an amplified systematic error? Something in your calibration, perhaps?" Eris felt his neck grow warm. "We've run every diagnostic we can think of, Evelyn. The instruments are functioning within their specified parameters." Another hand went up, a younger professor this time. "Your simulation is impressive, Eris, but it's just that, a simulation. You've tuned it to match your signal, haven't you? It's a classic case of confirmation bias. You see what you want to see." The questions kept coming, one after another, like gentle but persistent taps on a crack in a glass. "Have you considered the integrated foreground from dwarf galaxies? That could create a similar dip. The error bars on your data are still quite large. Can you truly rule out a statistical fluctuation? What about polarization leakage? Your instrument is notoriously sensitive to that." Eris answered each question as best he could, but he felt himself getting defensive. He wasn't being hailed as a pioneer. He was being cross-examined as a suspect. The tone wasn't hostile, but it was deeply, profoundly skeptical. They weren't trying to be mean. They were trying to save him from embarrassing himself. And more importantly, they were trying to protect the integrity of their field from a potential false claim. After the session ended, a few people came up to him. They patted him on the shoulder. "Interesting work, Eris," one said. "Keep at it. You just need more data." The words were encouraging, but the tone was the one you use with a student who has tried hard but ultimately come up short. He packed his laptop away, feeling a heavy weight of disappointment. On the long drive back to the desert, the stark, beautiful landscape did nothing to lift his spirits. The brilliant red rocks and vast open skies now seemed to mock him. His certainty, which had felt so solid in the control room, now felt naive. He arrived back at the facility late at night. Ilara and Mark were waiting for him in the control room, hoping for news. "Well?" Mark asked, his expression already guessing the answer. "Did we set the world on fire?" Eris managed a tired smile. "No fires. Just a lot of cold water." He told them about the questions, the skepticism, the polite dismissal. Ilara's face fell. "But they saw the simulation, right? They saw how it matches?" "They saw it," Eris said, sinking into a chair. "They just didn't believe it. Or rather, they believe we've believed a little too easily." For a moment, the three of them sat in a deflated silence. The dream was over. The ghost was just a glitch after all. Then Eris took a deep breath and looked at his two colleagues. He saw the disappointment in Ilara's eyes and the "I-told-you-so" resignation in Mark's. A strange feeling stirred in him. It wasn't excitement or certainty. It was something simpler, stubbornness. "You know what?" Eris said, his voice firmer now. "They're right." Mark frowned. "They are?" "Of course they are," Eris continued. "We would ask the same questions if we were in that audience. This is too big to be accepted on our word alone. We haven't done enough. Not yet." He stood up and walked to the whiteboard, picking up a marker. "So let's get to work. Ilara, Evelyn Reed asked about dwarf galaxy foregrounds. I want you to become the world's expert on that. Get all the latest data and model it against our signal. Mark, the question about polarization leakage was a good one. I want you to design a new calibration test, something so thorough it'll make our heads spin." He started writing on the board, creating a new list of tasks, a new mountain to climb. The doubt from the conference hadn't crushed him. It had given him a map. It showed him exactly where the walls of their argument were weak and now he knew where they needed to build them stronger. The bubble of excitement had popped, but what was left behind wasn't nothing. It was a foundation. The real work, the slow, unglamorous, and brutally difficult work of proving something to the world, was just beginning. And in a strange way, as he looked at the determined faces of his team, Aris felt more like a scientist than he ever had before. The desert facility transformed from a listening post into a fortress under siege. But the enemy wasn't outside. It was the lingering doubt, the what-ifs that had been voiced in that conference hall. Aris had taken the skepticism not as a rejection, but as a blueprint. The list on the whiteboard was their new battle plan. The next 6 months were a grind. The initial thrill of the discovery was gone, replaced by the slow, meticulous, and often frustrating work of defense. They were no longer explorers. They were engineers, building a bridge strong enough to carry the weight of their extraordinary claim. Ilara buried herself in the world of dwarf galaxies. Her desk disappeared under an avalanche of scientific papers and printouts of data from other telescopes. She spent days and then weeks writing code to model the faint collective radio hum of billions of tiny, unseen galaxies. The goal was to see if this combined static from the foreground could somehow mimic their precious signal. One afternoon, she let out a groan of frustration and let her head fall onto her keyboard with a soft thud. "Trouble in paradise?" Mark asked from his station, where he was wrestling with his own demons of calibration. "They're just so everywhere," Ilara mumbled, her voice muffled by the keys. "There are more dwarf galaxies than I thought. Mapping all their potential radio emissions is like trying to count every grain of sand in the desert outside." Aris walked over and placed a warm cup of tea next to her. "Then count them," he said gently. "One grain at a time. If our signal is real, it will still be there when you're done. And if it's not, then we will have saved ourselves from a great embarrassment." This became the new mantra. One grain at a time. Mark's task was even more technical and in some ways more tedious. He was building a new kind of calibration device, a small radio source they could place at a precise distance from the telescope dish. His goal was to test for polarization leakage, a tricky phenomenon where the telescope itself could subtly twist the signals it was receiving, potentially creating a false dip in the data. For weeks, he tinkered in the workshop next to the control room, surrounded by soldering irons, spools of wire, and circuit boards. The air smelled of hot metal and coffee. He would build a prototype, take it out to the dish in the blistering afternoon heat, run tests all night, and then come back in the morning, scowling at his data. "It's not clean enough," he'd mutter to Aris. "The noise from my own calibrator is messing with the readings. I'm trying to measure a whisper and I'm shouting in the same room." "Then find a way to whisper," Aris would reply, his voice always patient. The pressure was immense. There were no more dramatic late-night discoveries. There were only problems. A coding bug would set Ilara back 2 days. A faulty capacitor would ruin Mark's entire day's work. The grant money that kept the facility running was running low, and the university committee was asking for progress reports that Aris didn't know how to write. How do you explain that your progress is measured in problems solved, not in answers found? One particularly tough evening, Aris found Ilara still at her desk, her eyes red from staring at the screen. The simulation was running, but it was clear she had hit a wall. "I don't know if I can do this, Dr. Thorne," she said, her voice thick with tiredness. "What if they're right? What if we've wasted all this time on a ghost?" Aris pulled up a chair. "Let me tell you a story," he said. "When I was a young PhD student, I worked on a project to detect gravitational waves. For 10 years, we built these incredible sensitive machines, and for 10 years we saw nothing. Just noise. Many people called it a waste of time. They said we were chasing shadows. What happened?" Ilara asked. "Eventually they upgraded the machines, and they heard it. The sound of 2 black holes colliding a billion light-years away. That waste of time had built the foundation. It had taught them what the noise looked like, so they could recognize the music when it finally played." He pointed to her screen. "This, what we are doing now, is not a waste of time. This is us learning what the noise looks like. We are building the foundation. Even if our signal vanishes tomorrow, the work you are doing on dwarf galaxies will be used by someone else. The calibration tests Mark is inventing will make every telescope better. We are adding grains of sand to the pile. One day someone will stand on top of it and see the stars." His words didn't solve the coding bug or fix the faulty capacitor, but they changed the feeling in the room. The work wasn't just about proving they were right. It was about serving the truth no matter what it was. A few days later, a breakthrough happened, not with a bang, but with a sigh of relief. Ilara had finally finished her massive simulation of the dwarf galaxy foreground. She ran the final analysis, subtracting this new, more complete model of noise from their original data. They all gathered around her screen. The graph refreshed. The dip was still there. It was slightly changed, a little smoother on one edge, but it was undeniably, stubbornly present. The combined radio voice of 1 billion dwarf galaxies could not explain it away. Then a week after that, Mark finally triumphed. He had perfected his calibration device. His tests were now so clean, so precise that he could say with 95% certainty that polarization leakage was not creating their signal. They hadn't found new evidence for their signal. Instead, they had systematically burned down the forest of alternative explanations around it. Their lone, strange tree now stood in a clearing, exposed and undeniable. That night, the three of them sat together in the control room, eating a simple dinner of pizza. There were no celebrations, no shouts of victory, but the atmosphere was different. The weight of doubt had lessened. The fortress walls felt stronger. "We're not crazy," Mark said, taking a bite of his pizza. "Or at least we're not wrong about this." "Not yet," Eris said with a small, weary smile. "There are still more forests to burn, but we've saved our tree for another season." He looked out the window at the familiar dish, a silent silhouette against the twilight. The ghost was still there, and now they had built a house for it. The quiet confidence they had built over months of hard work was about to meet the outside world. After successfully defending their signal against the most obvious criticisms, Aris knew the next step was to publish their findings. This meant writing a paper, a formal, detailed document that would be sent to a prestigious scientific journal, where it would be judged by anonymous experts before it could be shared with the world. The writing process was a new kind of battle. It was no longer about code or calibrators. It was about words, clarity, and absolute honesty. They gathered in the small meeting room, the whiteboard now covered with outlines and bullet points. "We have to be like lawyers," Eris told Ilara and Mark. "But unlike lawyers, we are not just defending our client. We are also the prosecutors trying to tear our own case apart. We have to present every single weakness, every doubt we still have." For weeks they lived and breathed the paper. Ilara wrote the section on the dwarf galaxy foregrounds, explaining in painstaking detail how they had ruled it out. Mark described his intricate calibration tests, complete with complex diagrams of his homemade device. Eris wrote the introduction and the conclusion, his words measured and cautious, trying to balance the excitement of the discovery with the sober language of science. They argued over sentences. They debated the meaning of words like robust, suggestive, and compelling. "You can't say this proves the signal is cosmological," Mark insisted, pointing at Eris's draft. "You can only say the data are consistent with a cosmological origin. It's the same thing," Ilara argued, frustrated. "It's not," Eris said, siding with Mark. "In science, the words are everything. Proves is a word we almost never get to use. Consistent with is honest. It leaves the door open for us to be wrong." Finally, after countless drafts and late-night pizza sessions, the paper was finished. It was titled, in dry academic fashion, "A Detection of a Persistent Absorption Profile at Low Radio Frequencies Consistent with the Cosmic Dawn Signature." They attached their data, their code, and all their calibration logs. With a deep breath, Eris clicked the Submit button on the journal's website. Then they waited. The silence was worse than the work. Days turned into a week, then 2. Every time Eris's email dinged, his heart would jump. The atmosphere in the facility was tense, like waiting for a verdict from a jury they couldn't see. One afternoon, Eris was trying to fix a leaky faucet in the break room sink, a mundane task to keep his mind occupied, when his laptop chimed from the other room. It was a different sound, the sound of an important email. He walked in, his hands still wet. Ilara and Mark, sensing the moment, appeared in the doorway. "It's from the journal," Eris said, his voice neutral. He opened the email. His eyes scanned the text. The 3 referees, the anonymous expert scientists, had given their reports. The first one was positive. A potentially groundbreaking result, it read. The team has done commendable work in ruling out local interference. Aris felt a flutter of hope. Then he read the second report. It was harsh. The referee pointed to a different, more complex source of potential error they hadn't fully considered. While intriguing, the report stated, the authors have not convincingly demonstrated that this signal is not an artifact of the ionosphere's interaction with galactic synchrotron emission. It was a highly technical point, but a valid one. The referee concluded, I cannot recommend publication in its current form. The third report was somewhere in the middle, but also leaned towards rejection. The verdict was in. Not a rejection, but a revise and resubmit. It was a chance, but a slim one. They had to answer every single one of the referee's pointed questions, run new models, and strengthen their arguments. If their answers weren't good enough, the paper would be rejected for good. The hope that had flickered in the room died out. Mark sighed and walked away, muttering about the ionosphere. Ilara looked like she was about to cry. Aris, however, felt a strange sense of calm. He printed out the reports and laid them on the table. This is good, he said. How is this good? Ilara asked, her voice trembling with disappointment. Because, Aris explained, pointing at the harsh second report, this person is not our enemy. They are our most helpful colleague. They are not trying to kill our paper. They are trying to make it stronger. They have given us a gift, a list of exactly what we need to do next. They have shown us the next forest we need to burn. He picked up the printed comments. This referee is right. We didn't look deeply enough at the ionosphere. It's a messy, electrically charged layer of our own atmosphere. It could be distorting the signal. So our job is now very clear. We have to prove it's not. The new task felt like climbing a mountain they thought they had already summited, only to see a higher peak behind it. The ionosphere was a notorious problem for radio astronomers. It shimmered and changed like a living thing, affected by the sun's activity and the time of day. For the next 2 months, they became experts in the Earth's upper atmosphere. They partnered with a space weather center to get detailed data on the ionosphere's condition for every single hour they had collected their original data. Aris built a new, even more complex simulation, this time modeling not just the early universe, but the radio waves traveling through billions of light-years of space, only to pass through the turbulent ionosphere right before reaching their telescope. It was the hardest computational challenge he had ever faced. His computer fans whirred constantly, struggling with the load. More than once the simulation crashed and he had to start over. During this time, Aris missed his daughter's school play. He video called her afterwards, her face small on his phone screen. You didn't come, Papa, she said, her lower lip trembling slightly. I know, Beta. I'm so sorry, he said, his heart aching. Papa is trying to solve a very big puzzle. Is it the oldest song? Yes, but right now there's a lot of noise. It's like someone is singing, but there's a loud wind blowing and I have to find a way to hear through it. She thought about this for a moment. You should build a better ear, Papa. He laughed, a tired but genuine laugh. Yes, Beta. That's exactly what I'm trying to do. Finally, after weeks of work, the new simulation was complete. It showed that while the ionosphere did distort their data, it could not create the specific, sharp, and persistent dip they were seeing. In fact, when they corrected for the ionosphere's effect, their signal became even clearer. They compiled their new results, wrote a detailed, polite, point-by-point response to the referees, and resubmitted the paper. The second wait began. This one felt longer and more anxious than the first. They had given it everything they had. There was nothing left to add, no more arguments to make. The fate of their ghost was now in the hands of the invisible jury. They had done all they could. Now they could only hope that the world was finally ready to listen. The second wait was a strange, hollow time. The frantic energy of answering the referee's criticisms was gone, leaving behind a quiet void in the desert facility. The days felt longer, the hum of the computers more noticeable. They went through the motions of routine maintenance and minor projects, but their hearts weren't in it. Every conversation eventually circled back to the same unanswerable question. What would the journal say? Aris tried to distract himself by finally fixing things around the facility that had been neglected for months. He repaired the leaky faucet, patched a wobbly floorboard, and even attempted to tune up the old generator. The physical work was a relief, a way to quiet his mind. Mark buried himself in updating their data archives, a mind-numbingly boring task that suited his mood. Elara, unable to sit still, started a small vegetable garden behind the control room, her hands digging into the dry earth as if she could plant her anxiety there and watch it wither. 3 weeks after their resubmission, the email arrived. It was a Tuesday morning. Eris was in the break room, scrubbing a stubborn coffee stain from the counter. Elara was outside, watering her struggling tomato plants. Mark was the one who saw it. He didn't shout. He simply appeared in the doorway, his face pale. He just said Eris. Eris knew instantly. He dropped the sponge and walked slowly to his desk. Elara, seeing them through the window, came running in, her hands still covered in soil. With a deep breath, Eris opened the email from the journal's editor. He read it silently, his expression not changing. Elara and Mark watched him, barely breathing. The only sound was the gentle hum of the server racks. Then Eris's shoulders, which had been tense for months, slowly relaxed. A small, weary but genuine smile touched his lips. "It's accepted," he said, his voice soft and thick with emotion. "They're going to publish it." For a moment there was absolute silence. Then Elara let out a choked sob of relief and clapped her dirty hands over her mouth. Mark, the eternal skeptic, simply sank into a chair, a huge, disbelieving grin spreading across his face. "Well, I'll be damned," he whispered. The celebration was quiet, just the three of them sharing a pot of fresh coffee, the weight of years finally lifting. But Eris knew this was just the beginning of a new kind of storm. The paper would be published online in 48 hours. The world was about to find out. The calm ended the moment the paper went live. At first it was a trickle. A few emails from colleagues. "Congratulations, Eris." "Incredible work." Then more emails. Then the phone started ringing. It was the public relations department from the university, then a science journalist from a major news outlet. By the next morning, the trickle had become a flood. A news van, bristling with antennas, rumbled down the long dirt road and parked outside the gate. Eris's phone buzzed constantly with calls from numbers he didn't recognize. His inbox was flooded with interview requests. He had become overnight the man who had heard the dawn of time. The facility was thrown into chaos. The university sent a PR manager, a brisk, efficient woman named Sarah, who immediately took over the control room, turning it into a makeshift media center. She coached Eris on how to speak to reporters, repeating phrases like cautiously optimistic and "this is just the first step." Eris's first live television interview was a blur of bright lights and a reporter's overly cheerful face. He tried to explain the cosmic dawn in simple terms, comparing the primordial hydrogen to a morning fog and the first stars to the sun burning it away. He spoke about the years of work, the doubt, the persistence. The reporter smiled and called it a eureka moment, a term Eris hated. It hadn't been a eureka moment. It had been 1,000 small, difficult moments of not giving up. When the segment aired, his daughter saw it. She video called him, her eyes wide. "Papa, you're on TV. You found the song." "Yes, Beta," he said, feeling a mix of pride and exhaustion. "We found one note of it." But with the attention came a new, more intense wave of scrutiny. The scientific community was not just reading his paper. They were dissecting it. Blog posts and online forums lit up with debates. Some scientists hailed it as a historic discovery. Others were deeply skeptical, just like the conference crowd. But now their voices were amplified. He saw a headline from a popular science blog. "Has Edges found the cosmic dawn, or just a glitch in the desert?" The pressure was immense. He was expected to be the confident leader, the face of a revolution in cosmology, but inside he still felt like the same cautious scientist, haunted by the possibility of being wrong. He missed the quiet of the desert, the simple routine of watching data scroll across a screen. He missed the time when the only people he had to convince were Elara and Mark. One evening, after a long day of back-to-back interviews, Eris escaped the media circus and walked out into the desert. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. He climbed a small rocky hill and looked back at the facility, now swarming with activity. He felt a hand on his shoulder. It was Mark, who had quietly followed him. "Quite a mess, huh?" Mark said, handing him a bottle of water. "It's not what I wanted," Eris admitted, his voice tired. "I just wanted to know the answer. I didn't want to be a celebrity scientist." "You're not a celebrity," Mark said with a grunt. You're just the guy holding the flag at the front of the charge. And you know what happens to the guy at the front? He gets shot at first, Eris smiled weakly. That's not very comforting, Mark. It's not meant to be. It's meant to be true. But look behind you. He gestured towards the facility. The charge is happening. The whole world is talking about the cosmic dawn because of what we did in that little building. That's something. Eris looked up at the sky, where the first stars were beginning to appear. The same stars that were the descendants of the ones he was searching for. He was no longer just a listener in the dark. He had thrown a stone into the quiet pond of science, and the ripples were spreading everywhere. He had wanted to start a conversation, and he had succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. Now he just had to survive it. The media storm, as suddenly as it had arrived, began to move on. The news vans packed up and left, chasing the next big story. The flood of emails slowed to a trickle. The world had absorbed the headline. Scientists hear the echo of the first stars and then moved on. For Eris and his team, this was a relief. It allowed the real and much more important scientific conversation to begin. But this conversation was not happening in television studios. It was happening in the quiet, rigorous world of peer-reviewed science, and it was far from a victory parade. The paper was out. A small boat launched into a vast and critical ocean. Eris found himself in a new, strange role. He was no longer just a researcher. He was a defender of a controversial idea. He was invited to more conferences, but now the rooms were packed. He would give his talk, showing their data, their simulations, their painstaking work to rule out errors. And then the questions would come. They were more technical, more pointed than before. A young, brilliant theorist from Europe would stand up. Your signal requires the primordial gas to be significantly colder than our standard models allow, he would say, his tone not hostile, but intensely curious. What is the physical mechanism for this extra cooling? Are you proposing new physics? Eris would nod, acknowledging the gravity of the question. The amplitude is indeed a challenge for the standard model, he'd admit. We are not proposing new physics, but we are suggesting that our data may be a hint that our understanding of this epoch is incomplete. It could be interactions with dark matter or something else we haven't yet considered. The signal is what it is. It's our theories that may need to bend. This was the core of the debate. Their signal was so strong that to explain it, physicists might have to rewrite a page in the textbook of the early universe. To many, this was thrilling. To others, it was a red flag, a sign that the signal must be wrong. Back at the facility, the mood was tense but focused. They were no longer working in isolation. They were part of a global conversation. Alara spent her days monitoring online repositories where other teams would post their own analyses, sometimes supporting their findings, sometimes trying to poke holes in them. Look at this, she said one afternoon, calling Eris and Mark over. A team from a rival university had published a preprint, a paper not yet formally reviewed, arguing that a complex combination of radiation from our own galaxy could mimic the edge's signal if not handled in a very specific. Wait, it's the foreground argument again, Mark grumbled, but with bigger words. It's a good argument, Eris said, studying the paper. They found a potential weakness we didn't fully cover. This is how it's supposed to work. They are being good scientists. He turned to Alara. I want you to work with this. Take their model, apply it to our raw data. Let's see if their method can actually make our signal disappear. This became their new normal. Instead of being defensive, they became collaborators in their own criticism. Every new challenge was a homework assignment assigned by the global scientific community. They would spend weeks digging into the latest critique, testing it, and then publishing their own response. The pressure was immense. Eris felt the eyes of the entire field upon him. His every word in talks and in emails was carefully measured. The dreamy, romantic quest to hear the oldest song had been replaced by a brutal intellectual marathon. One night, he received an email from Dr. Evelyn Reed, the sharp-tongued cosmologist who had been one of his first critics. His heart sank, expecting another brutal takedown. He opened it nervously. The email was short. Eris, I remain skeptical. The cooling problem is a major hurdle. However, I have reviewed your team's response to the ionosphere criticism and your latest data release. The transparency and rigor are commendable. You are conducting this investigation with the integrity it deserves. Please continue. Best Evelyn. It wasn't an endorsement, but it was something perhaps more valuable. Respect. It meant they were being taken seriously. They were in the ring, and they were still standing. This small gesture of respect was more encouraging than any newspaper headline. It reminded Eris that this wasn't a battle to be won, but a mystery to be solved, collectively. He was not a general leading an army, but a guide helping the entire scientific community explore a strange new piece of territory. He called his daughter that night. She was doing a school project on the solar system. "Papa, is Pluto a planet?" she asked. "It's complicated, Beta," he said with a tired laugh. "Some people say yes, some people say no. It's a big debate. Like your song?" "Yes, exactly like my song. Everyone is trying to figure out what it is." He looked out at the dark desert, the familiar dish a silent silhouette. The journey felt longer and lonelier than ever. But for the first time, he truly felt he wasn't alone on it. An army of the world's brightest minds, both supporters and skeptics, were now on the march with him, all trying to solve the same beautiful, maddening puzzle. The ghost had left the machine and was now haunting the halls of science itself. The debate raged on in the world of physics, a quiet war fought in conference halls and online forums. For Eris and his team, it became a background hum to their daily lives, like the constant hiss of the cosmos they studied. They had done all they could to defend their signal. Now, the scientific process demanded something more powerful than any argument: independent confirmation. The problem was, their experiment, EDGES, was unique. Its design, its location in the radio-quiet desert, and its specific calibration methods were all tailored to hear this one faint whisper. To prove they weren't fooling themselves, someone else, somewhere else in the world, with a completely different instrument, had to hear it too. The wait for this confirmation was a different kind of torture. It was a test of faith. Eris watched the literature, reading every new paper about the early universe, looking for any hint that another team was getting close. Months turned into a year. The initial media frenzy felt like a distant memory, replaced by a grinding, slow-burning anxiety. During this time, the team's paths began to gently diverge. It was a natural, bittersweet evolution. Mark, the master of hardware, was recruited by a major observatory to help design their next-generation radio telescope. It was a fantastic opportunity, a chance to build something even bigger and better. His last day at the desert facility was a quiet one. "Well," Mark said, shaking Eris's hand firmly, "try not to find the meaning of life in the static after I'm gone. And for heaven's sake, get a new coffee maker." Eris smiled. "We wouldn't have gotten this far without your stubbornness, Mark." "Thank you. Just don't be wrong," Mark replied, his usual gruffness not quite hiding his emotion. "I don't want to have to fly back here and say I told you so." With Mark gone, the facility felt larger and emptier. Ilara, now a seasoned and respected researcher in her own right, took on more responsibility. She started collaborating with a team in Europe, sharing techniques and data. She was becoming a bridge to the wider scientific community. One afternoon, Eris was alone in the control room, going over some old data archives. The silence was profound. He thought about the years he had spent in this room, the hopes, the doubts, the late nights. He looked at Mark's empty chair and felt a pang of loneliness. The quest had defined his life for so long, and now it felt suspended, waiting for a verdict from a court he couldn't see. His phone buzzed. It was a notification from a scientific alert service. A new preprint had been posted to a popular online archive. The title made his heart stop. A tentative detection of the 21 Cm absorption signal from the cosmic dawn with the Ceres-3 experiment. Ceres. It was a rival experiment. A team in India, led by a brilliant and notoriously careful scientist named Professor Chaudhry. Their method was completely different. Instead of a large, stationary dish in a desert, Ceres was a small, portable antenna deployed on a raft in the middle of a remote lake, using the pure water to shield it from radio interference. With trembling hands, Eris downloaded the paper. He skimmed the abstract, his eyes searching for the key words. Consistent with cooler primordial gas, supports the EDGES finding. He couldn't breathe. He read it again, slowly, carefully, line by line. It wasn't a perfect identical match. Their signal was weaker, noisier. The paper was filled with caution, using phrases like tentative evidence and requires further verification. Professor Chaudhry was not declaring victory. He was adding a single, cautious piece to the puzzle, but the piece fit. Their independent, creatively designed experiment had found a shadow in the same place. The ghost had been seen by another set of eyes. Eris didn't shout. He didn't cry. He simply put his head in his hands, a wave of pure, unadulterated relief washing over him so powerfully it left him weak. The weight of the world, the weight of doubt he had carried for years, felt a little lighter. He stood up and walked outside, the dry desert air hitting his face. He needed to tell someone. He called Ilara, who was working from her apartment in the nearby town. "Ilara," he said, his voice cracking. "Check the archive." "Saris." He heard the frantic clicking of a keyboard on the other end of the line. Then a sharp intake of breath. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Eris, is this real?" "It's real," he said, his voice firm now. "It's not a confirmation, not yet. But it's a witness. We are not alone in the dark anymore." He then called Mark. When he told him the news, there was a long silence on the line. "Well, I'll be," Mark finally said, a note of awe in his voice. "Chaudhry's a tough nut. If he's seeing it, it's there." That evening, Eris sat alone on the same rocky hill where he and Mark had spoken during the media frenzy. The sun was setting, painting the sky in familiar shades of orange and purple. But the view felt different tonight. He wasn't holding a flag at the front of a charge anymore. He was part of a community, a global network of curious minds, all slowly closing in on the same truth. The Saris result was like a faint answering call from across a vast ocean. It didn't prove they were right, but it proved they weren't crazy. The journey wasn't over. There would be more debates, more analyses, more years of work. But the crushing isolation was gone. As the first stars appeared in the twilight sky, Eris didn't feel like a lonely listener. He felt like a member of a chorus, and another voice had just quietly joined the song. The tentative signal from the Saras team was like a single green shoot after a long winter. It didn't change the landscape overnight, but it promised that the ground was fertile, that something was alive. The scientific debate, which had been a tense stalemate, began to shift. The question was no longer, is this signal real? But what does this signal mean? Eris found himself invited to a very different kind of conference. This one was smaller, held at a quiet retreat center, and included only the top theorists and experimentalists in the field. The goal was not to present to a large audience, but to huddle together and figure out what to do next. He walked into a room filled with the very people whose names were on the textbooks he had studied as a student. Dr. Evelyn Reed was there, and she gave him a brief acknowledging nod. Professor Chaudhry, the leader of the Saris project, was there too, a quiet, thoughtful man who spoke only when he had something important to say. The first day was a deep dive into the cooling problem. A theorist named Ben, a young man with wild hair and boundless energy, stood at the whiteboard, covering it with equations. The edges signal, and now the hint from Saris, suggests the primordial hydrogen was much colder than we thought, Ben said, his marker squeaking across the board. So what cooled it down? The standard models can't explain it. We need something new. He drew a large question mark. The most exciting possibility is an interaction with dark matter. Eris listened, fascinated. For years he had been focused on the detection, proving the signal existed. Now he was listening to people discuss its profound implications. His little dip in the data was forcing them to reconsider the fundamental ingredients of the universe. During a coffee break, Professor Chaudhry approached him. "Dr. Thorne," he said, his voice soft, "your team's transparency with your data was very helpful. It allowed us to design our analysis to avoid some of the same pitfalls." "Thank you, Professor," Eris replied. "Your work. It means more to me than I can say," Chaudhry offered a small smile. "We are both just listening to the same faint echo. It is good to have a friend in the silence." The conference ended with a new sense of purpose. The community was mobilizing. New projects were proposed. Bigger telescopes, more sensitive antennas, and more powerful simulations, all designed to either confirm the signal beyond any doubt or to finally understand its strange properties. When Eris returned to the desert facility, it was no longer the end of the line. It was the beginning of a new chapter. The work they had done was now the foundation for a global effort. He and Ilara began the process of packing up the Edges experiment. Its job was done. It had thrown the first stone. One evening, as they were carefully cataloging equipment, Ilara looked at the massive, silent dish one last time. "It's strange," she said. "After all these years, it feels like saying goodbye to an old friend." "It's not a goodbye," Eris said. "It's a thank you. This old friend gave us a message. Now it's up to others to understand what the message means. He received an email a few weeks later. It was from the director of a consortium building the next generation Cosmic Dawn Explorer, a billion-dollar project that would map the early universe in unprecedented detail. The email was an invitation for Eris to join their science definition team. His experience, his hard-won knowledge from years in the desert, was now considered essential guidance for the future. He accepted. On his last day at the facility, Eris stood alone in the empty control room. The computers were off, the desks were clear. The constant, comforting hum of the servers was gone, replaced by a profound silence. He looked out the window at the dish, which was now pointed at the horizon, inactive. He didn't feel sadness. He felt a deep, quiet satisfaction. The long, lonely vigil was over. The baton was being passed. He thought about the journey, from the first frustrating years of silence, to Ilara's discovery of the ghost in the machine, to the brutal peer review, the media storm, and the slow, cautious validation from their peers. He thought of Mark's grumpy loyalty and Ilara's brilliant dedication. He had come here to listen for a whisper from the dawn of time. He had found it. But he had also found something else, the true meaning of science. It wasn't about a single brilliant person having a eureka moment. It was about a community, a sometimes argumentative, always skeptical, but ultimately collaborative community, slowly, patiently, piecing together a truth that was bigger than any one of them. As he locked the door to the control room for the final time, he didn't feel like he was closing a chapter. He felt like he was handing over the first page of a new story to the rest of the world. The Cosmic Dawn was no longer his secret. It was humanity's next frontier. Years later, Eris Thorne found himself standing under a night sky that was both familiar and entirely new. He was a visitor at the site of the next-generation Cosmic Dawn Explorer, a project he had helped design. The remote desert here was similar to his old home, but the technology was not. Gone was the single massive dish. In its place was a sprawling forest of simple white antennas, stretching for miles across the dry earth, looking less like a machine and more like a strange, minimalist garden. This was an interferometer, a collective ear made of thousands of small parts, working together to hear with a clarity he could only have dreamed of. A young engineer, barely out of university, was giving him a tour. "The first full-depth data run begins tonight, Dr. Thorne," she said, her voice buzzing with excitement. "We're hoping to not just confirm the absorption signal, but to actually map its structure. We might see the bubbles of the first stars and galaxies starting to form." Eris simply nodded, a quiet smile on his face. He was now the seasoned veteran, the one who had laid the groundwork. The students here saw him as a legend, a founding father. It was a strange feeling for a man who still thought of himself as just a stubborn listener. He was given a guest pass to the new control room. It was a vast, quiet space, cool and dark, with a massive curved screen dominating one wall. On it, a visual representation of the data would soon begin to paint itself, a map of the infant universe. As the final systems check began, Eris's phone vibrated. It was a video call. He stepped into a quiet corner and answered. His daughter's face appeared, now a young woman, her own curiosity about the world shining in her eyes. "Papa, are you there? Is it starting?" she asked. "I'm here, Beta. They're just about to begin." "I wish I was there with you." "You are," he said, and he meant it. He found a seat at the back of the room, away from the bustling young scientists. He watched them, this new generation with their confident typing and their quiet, focused chatter. They were standing on the shoulders of his work, of Mark's stubborn calibrations, of Ilara's relentless data checking. He felt a profound sense of peace. This was how it was meant to be. The lead engineer gave the command. "Initiating sequence. Array is live." The large screen flickered to life. At first it was just a field of blue representing the silence, the cosmic background. Then as the antennas began to collect their first moments of deep, integrated data, a color began to bloom. A deep ruddy red, exactly where the models, his models now refined and improved, predicted it would be. It was their signal. But it was no longer just a line on a graph, a single note. On this screen it was a patch of color, a vast cosmic structure. It was the shadow of the primordial fog, and within that red swath, the supercomputers were already starting to identify tiny, Nascent irregularities, the faintest hints of the first structures beginning to clump together, the seeds of everything that would ever be. There was no cheering. The room was filled with a reverent silence, broken only by the whispered analysis of the scientists. They were witnessing the universe turning on the lights. Eris didn't need to look at the screen anymore. He closed his eyes. He thought of the long, lonely nights in his old control room, the sting of skepticism, the weight of doubt, the joy of a single independent confirmation. He thought of the journey, not the destination. He had spent his life trying to explain the cosmic dawn slowly, and he had learned that the explanation wasn't just in the data or the theories. It was in the people. It was in the shared struggle to understand something vast and beautiful and older than time itself. The universe had sung its oldest song. It had been a faint, almost impossible to hear melody, but he had listened. And because he had listened, others had learned how to hear it too. Now, a new chorus was beginning, one that would map the dawn of time itself. He opened his eyes and looked out a large window at the field of antennas under the starry sky. The work was done, and the work had just begun. The static was no longer static. It was a story, and it was finally being read not by one man in a desert but by all of humanity. He had kept his promise. He had built a better ear, and now everyone could hear the music.